Hi and welcome back to PDA Dad UK. In this episode I'm going to be looking at the role of dopamine and how it affects autism, how it affects ADHD and how it affects pathological demand avoidance. As I say, welcome back to PDA Dad UK. Before I do go on any further, I would make a huge difference to me personally if you could just go on, hit like, hit subscribe and ring the bell. You'll always know when new content's coming up, and it makes a dramatic difference for the YouTube algorithms and how this video gets out there. You'll be doing me a personal favor and I'd really appreciate it. Please go do that now. As I said before, what I want to cover in this episode is the role of dopamine and how it affects autism, ADHD, PDA, and any other forms of neurodiversity or life in general for most people. It's a fascinating area, and it's something I've only recently sort of come into learning about and identifying with and seeing how it plays such an important role in our lives. And this came about because I interviewed a good friend of mine, Alan, on my other channel, which is the Grumpy Gits. I'll put a link in the description. You can go and check that out. And he's ADHD. He's an adult diagnosed ADHDer, and he has been looking into it himself, and he put me onto something which is the role of dopamine and how it affects the mind basically, and why it has an effect on ADHD and autism in many different areas. And that's what we're sort of going to delve into. But really what we need to do first is identify what dopamine is and how it works. So dopamine is actually a neurotransmitter, which is basically a chemical messenger, and it's part of how our brain processes the sensation of pleasure that we get. So when we find something we enjoy doing, dopamine is released, and it tells us that we're enjoying this and we want more. So dopamine comes into play in so many different ways. It's in attraction, it's in our relationships, it's in the things that we enjoy doing. So when you find that sort of, when you're really getting into something, it has that's basically the brain releasing dopamine, telling our body this is enjoyable and we want more of it. And it's a big part of how we learn, how we are able to retain tension with the things that we enjoy doing. If we're not receiving the right amounts of dopamine, that's when we tend to turn off of things. So if something's not exciting, as if you're watching a show and it's just awful, or you're doing something that's a menial to it, if it's taking out the rubbish or doing the washing up or whatever, that's when the dopamine is restricted and it's telling our body we're not really enjoying this. So dopamine affects so many different areas of our lives. It affects our learning and our motivation. So like I say, if we're finding something interesting, it motivates us to do it. That's part of dopamine telling us this is enjoyable and pleasurable and we want more of it. And it also affects different parts of our body. So like heart function, kidney function, big parts of our body are actually affected by the levels of dopamine that we have. And it's very important that our body keeps dopamine in the right levels within our body to keep us healthy. And in fact, a lack of dopamine has been associated not just with mental health conditions, but with physical health conditions as well. So things like Parkinson's disease are directly related to the production of dopamine by the brain. And that's why the effects of Parkinson's can be so severe. It actually affects our physical body as well as our mental health. But it's really the mental health aspect that I want to focus on here, and certainly our brain function and how it affects us in a mental capacity. So a lot of mental health conditions can be associated with different levels of dopamine. Now I want to go on here and say that a lot of this is theory. So this isn't stuff that's been necessarily proven, but it's certainly, there's a very strong case for it. And it makes a lot of sense to me, which you'll see as we go on in this video, as to why dopamine has such a massive effect on us, and why in particular it affects people like my daughter, who is autistic, who is ADHD and has PDA. Those are all affected by the production of dopamine. So to dial it back and just put it in very basic, understandable terms, if you like, basically, we require the dopamine level to be at a certain level to allow us to concentrate. So ADHD is really where this focuses, but it affects autism as well, very, very strongly, which obviously relates to PDA and a lot of neurodivergencies. With dopamine being not produced enough, it means that you can find just not a lack of interest in something. So it's noted that ADHDers will go from thing to thing to thing, and they're not really getting into it. And they often go for more extreme things to engage with. So a lot of ADHDers will find themselves getting involved in sort of high impact or extreme sports, if you like, and stuff like that. Things that really do get the dopamine going, because that's kind of what the body's searching for and crying out for. It means that it's very hard to focus on one thing at a time for any period of time, because the dopamine levels are just telling the body, well, the lack of dopamine level is basically telling the body, I'm not interested, this doesn't interest me, and I'm going to move on to the next thing. So that's why you get that kind of erratic behavior associated often with autism, and certainly with ADHD, is the fact that the dopamine isn't being produced by the brain in the levels that are high enough. And so it's hard to continue the engagement and find the interest to continue and motivate you to do more of the thing that you need to do. It's why a lot of these kids struggle in schools, because they're just not, according, this is theory, but it's a theory that makes a lot of sense. Because the dopamine levels aren't adequate, they find a lack of interest, they lose concentration, and they start trying to find things that are going to engage them for that period of time. And that can end up leading to the disruptive behaviors and stuff like that we talk about, or are talked about with both ADHD, autism, and definitely with PDA. So if you think about it, it really does make so much sense, and it's why I really subscribe to this, and why I found this to be a really interesting area. If the dopamine levels being produced by the brain aren't in the right amounts that allow us to engage with the activities that we need to do, then it creates an issue. Now, obviously, we all have activities and things that we love to do, and that's where we find that dopamine level increases. So for me, music's a really good example, and I love music. I was talking to a good friend of mine recently who was saying that, who's actually shared something on her Instagram, which is the Arty Bohemian, who I've interviewed on this channel previously. Do go check out her video. It's really fascinating, and it relates to this in a very strong way, which I'll come to a bit later in the video. Well, she's talking about how she loves music and how music affects her in different ways and helps her. And she's an autistic person. She's an ADHDer, and she, shares that quite openly. So, the function of music in her life is huge, and it's the same thing for me. I get extreme pleasure from music. When music feels a certain way, it sets off my dopamine. I get that feeling of extreme pleasure, and I can get lost in the music. It takes me to a different place, and it's a wonderful thing. That's dopamine acting in a way it should. It's telling me something is pleasurable and responding to it. And people can get it from various different things. Exercise is very strongly associated with it. Maybe not when you're doing it so much, but afterwards, that feeling of pleasure, that's the body sort of releasing the dopamine, telling you this is a really good thing, and inspires you to go on further. I've always struggled with exercise. It's always something that I've really hated. When I got into exercise more recently, I was surprised. It was the afterwards that really affected me, and it spurred me on to do more. The body was recognizing the benefits it was giving me, and so it was adjusting my dopamine levels to say, yes, this is a good thing, carry on doing it. And more I've got to enjoy exercise as I've got into that, and it's always been something I've just hated in the past. So it's a really interesting facet of how that works. So with people with ADHD, people who are autistic, people who are PDAs, this is something that can affect their lives dramatically, because the brain isn't producing enough dopamine to keep them interested in the things they need to be interested in, or they should be interested in, if you like. It has that effect. It means that the mundane tasks don't really appeal. And you see that especially with ADHD, is where it's kind of, trying to focus on something that is mundane is nigh on impossible for many people. And that's because the dopamine isn't being released and isn't being processed in the right ways. And so what's happening is that lack of interest then triggers to go on to something else and something else. But it also can have a thing where when something is found that really, really is entertaining or really is producing pleasure, it can release more of it, and so the body seeks that more. Now, a really good example of this is in video games and devices. Now, we've talked before on this channel about the ways that devices can actually be a very positive thing for many people who are neurodivergent. It's a whole world that's controllable. It can be exciting, and you can focus in on it in a way that shuts everything else out. It can be a really, really helpful thing. Not necessarily always a good thing, but there are certainly arguments there. And I see it in my daughter when she's able to engage. If she's really stressed and upset and she needs to just mellow out and needs to bring herself back down to a more manageable anxiety level, engaging in something on a device and playing a game, going on Roblox or Minecraft, or even just watching TikToks, or we don't let her watch TikTok, but YouTube now has the YouTube Shorts. it's short videos and YouTube videos. She'll hop on there and she can focus in on it, and it shuts the world out. And this is called hyperfocus. And hyperfocus is another facet of this. And I didn't realize that hyperfocus was such a big part of things like ADHD. You think of ADHD as being the flitting from one thing to the next and not being, being hyperactive and just not able to focus and stay on one thing at a time. You get the hyperactivity thing. That whole thing is what's focused on with ADHD. But what's often not sort of discussed enough is the fact that hyperfocus really comes into it. So going back to the conversation I had with my friend Alan, and he was, I asked him, he's a fantastic musician to the point that I'm jealous. He's an amazing guitar player. He's a fantastic singer, and he writes incredible music. And I said, is that part of the hyperfocus? Is that what that is for you? And what he came back to me with was that, and the quote is really interesting. It's that ADHD is the reason I'm a good musician. It's also the reason I'm not a great musician. You're a very, very good musician. Is that right? Played into that? Did you think from back in the day, because it was, setting the right
It's signal? How I got good. But it's how I got good, but it's why I never was great. Because while it was novel and really interesting, and I would hyper focus on that, like playing guitar, I got quite good at guitar very quickly. And then at some point the novelty had worn off, and so the dopamine's not firing anymore, is it? So then it becomes a little bit more like work, and so I kind of stayed as a, what's that phrase? I'm the world's okayest guitar player. Because hyperfocus got me there very quickly, and now I don't. So
when he started getting into music, he was playing it, he was getting into it, and it was producing the dopamine from his brain, and he was responding, and so he really got into it, and he learned a lot over a fairly quick period of time. But like anything, when you're involved with it over a period of time, it starts to lose the shine, if you like. And so for him, that ebbed off over time. And so the ability to engage and enjoy music in the same way was reduced. And so he moved on to the next thing, which was the next thing for his hyperfocus. And indeed, finding out about all this sort of stuff is, once he'd been diagnosed as ADHD, he started to hyperfocus on what is ADHD and what can I do to help manage it. And it's been a really positive thing in his life, but that is another area of the hyperfocus. So it's somewhere he's looking to go that's going to trigger, it's all on a subconscious level. It's going to trigger the dopamine from the brain that's going to get him excited and interested and produces that side of things. And a lot of medications that work for ADHD are actually about stabilizing dopamine levels and helping the body to process it in a better way and the brain to process it in a better way, so that the concentration and the engagement is really, really increased. That's how these medications work for a lot of ADHD medications in particular. Now, hyperfocus is an amazing thing, and I'm envious of hyperfocus in many ways. And going back to my friend Em, who does Adi Bohemian, so she runs this jewelry making business, and she has this ability to go and focus on things that I would not notice. When we've caught up with, families got together and we've gone out for walks and stuff like that, she's the one who's looking at all the different things, and she'll see things in nature that I would completely miss. She sort of sees microcosms and little worlds in themselves, and she takes photos of them all, and that's what translates to her artwork. So when she makes this jewelry, she contains this sort of world in a world, if you like, and she makes her jewelry in that way, and it is fantastic stuff. And it's her ability to do that is the triggering from really a hyperfocus that allows her to see things in a different way and then process it. But what she finds is that she enjoys the process of making the jewelry so much and making her artworks so much that it's triggering that dopamine. So she's able to focus on it for much longer periods of time than I would be able to.
It means I can completely zone in on what I'm doing. It means I have a different perspective to most, which gives me my unique selling point for my work, really. It's different to what anyone, because I'm coming at everything from a different angle. I notice tiny things, and that comes through in my work. And when I am working, I'm entirely on that. I just go into like, it's almost meditative. And I find it really therapeutic as well to have a lot of time in that hyper focus zone. Everything else sort of is in the background. I've usually got music on, which I am listening to at the same time and enjoying, but everything else is gone, and I'm just in this world and in my own world, playing, experimenting, finishing stuff. Sometimes it can take, if I'm feeling out of sorts, it can take a while to get into that state of mind, but once I'm in there, I don't want to come out of it either. You know, I'm like, oh no, it's the school run, oh bummer. Yeah, it's just that sort of intense zoning in and being able to really focus on getting something just how you want it.
And the beauty of what she does, because it's an art form, she can change it up. So if one thing's getting a little drab, she can then change onto another thing and start making those. And so there's always something new and fresh. And it makes a huge difference for her. She's able to hyper focus on these things, and she can work for hours and hours at a time creating this amazing stuff, and time just flies by for her. Again, she loves music on when she's doing it because it actually helps her with that. Again, it's that sort of creating that level of pleasure and enjoyment, and that really comes out. So there's this real love that goes into her jewelry. I'll put a link up to her webpage in the description, so please don't go check it out. It's amazing stuff, and she's incredibly talented. And she's one of my good friends who I'm able to, because she's autistic, being able to speak to her and get the feedback and you know, check in on things is just a real benefit for me, because it helps me understand my daughter. It helps me understand where she's at, because I'm getting it from the source, if you like. It makes a real difference. All this comes back to is basically that the brain works in so many incredible ways, and the production of dopamine is something that's just so incredibly important. If your kids are struggling with that sort of retention, if they're diagnosed with ADHD, then you can talk about getting medications that may help. You know, a lot of people don't like medications. I'm on the fence about it, and I've always been in the past somebody who hates medications for many, many reasons. I think they're doled out far too readily. But we've been in a situation more recently with my daughter where we've been forced to use a medication. So my daughter had a very bad episode, and we ended up being taking her to hospital. She had to be treated and observed for a few days, basically. Part of that was, the result of that was that she got placed under a child psychiatrist who was basically my kind of guy. He sat me down and he said, look, what you've got to understand is I don't like giving medications to kids. And he rattled back all the reasons that I would have given, the reasons I don't like medications being doled out so readily. But he said, in this situation, I can really see the need. And so we accepted that, and we worked with him. And my daughter's gone onto a medication that has really, really helped her to reduce the anxieties, basically. So it's not an ADHD medication. This is one that's about managing her anxiety so that her behaviours are able to be contained somewhat, and she's happier in herself. It's been a really amazing thing to see. And I bring this back to someone said to me a long while back. I had to go on antidepressants. In fact, I went on to antidepressants myself fairly recently. Over the summer holidays, I was really struggling. I find them the hardest time of year. And I talked about this in my video about my own mental health. Now, I don't have a depressive personality at all. But there are 2 times in my life where I've really felt the need to go on medication. This was one of them, and one was over sort of 10, 12 years ago. And I just reached a point where I knew something was wrong. I was really low. And I spoke to my GP, who was a friend, and he explained it to me like this. He said that the brain is just this amazing thing, but it has to have the right chemicals being released to work appropriately. And if you've been under a lot of pressure for a long period of time, the synapses between the brain stop working properly, and that chemical is running out, basically. So if you liken it to diabetes, because the insulin isn't being produced in the right levels by the body, it needs more insulin. So diabetics have to take insulin to manage those levels. Likewise, if you've got something like, a deficiency, a vitamin deficiency, if you need more vitamin C, you go out and you get it. Everyone would just do it. You go out and take a vitamin C pill, and that tops you up. Any kind of deficiency like that, you just top it up. If the brain is lacking the chemicals that are required to help it work in an effective, functional way, then that's what you're doing. And the medications that he prescribed and put me onto, he explained, it's basically just replacing the chemical that's missing in your brain at the moment, or it isn't being produced enough in your brain at the moment. And you take it for a brief period of time. I took it over a number of weeks, and it just helped lift me out of the funk I was stuck in, if you like. And then I was able to come off it and return to life as normal. It was a remarkable thing. And so my understanding and my appreciation for medications has changed somewhat over time. They're a good thing in the right circumstances. And that's why you should always seek professional advice. You should always see a GP and get the right referrals in place. Things like sleep medications and melatonin and all that kind of stuff. It's very tempting to hop online and order them from the States. And it's actually really dangerous. And especially in the UK, it's illegal. If you're giving a controlled substance in the UK to your kids without a prescription, social services can get involved. There can be a whole lot of issues that follow on from it. Always go to your GP as the source, but fight as well. If you really feel something is needed and you're just being dismissed, which happens sadly, if that's the case, then go do what you've got to do and keep fighting for it. But don't ever cross that line, if you like. It's a dangerous thing. And, that's the lesson I've learned. If the doctors are behind you, then you've got something to run with that is coming from the right source and is coming from the right understanding and able to be focused in the right way. Meds can be a really healthy thing, but I think they can also be really overused. And as I say, I worry that, I think it's changing now. The pendulum's starting to swing back the other way, but there was a period of time where it just seemed like, meds were just being doled out for mental health issues left, right and centre without really doing much research into what the triggers and the cause were of the mental health issues. And if someone's got a mental health issue that is an ongoing one, so my wife is bipolar, that requires medication. And it requires medication because her brain just doesn't process things in the way that is healthy for her. And it leads to those incredible highs and those incredible lows as well. So having a mood stabilizer is essential. And again, it's just coming back to the chemicals in the brain that aren't being produced in the right levels that they need to be produced in. So it is finding that balance within that to help. That's really what I wanted to say about this. It's a fascinating thing for me, and I find it so interesting that the brain works in such an amazing way, and that it creates all these different kinds of people, and the differences in us all, and the things that we find interesting are different from what other people find interesting, and the things that fire our dopamine is different from somebody else's. And so I might love music, somebody else might like country music, and I can't stand country music. There are so many different ways that it speaks to us, and the ways that the brain processes our world around us and gives us this output and shows us what we love and what we don't love. I would love to hear from you. Please do go put in the comments. If you are an ADHD or autistic yourself and you find this in your life, I'd love to hear your experiences and how you've come to manage it and to work with it in your life. Likewise, if you've got kids who are either autistic or have other neurodivergencies or ADHD or PDA, and you've got experience of this and you've been able to find ways that you can help your kids, please let us know. Please do put it in the comments. It makes a huge difference, and I'd love to hear from you. Please do hit like, as I say, hit subscribe, ring the bell so that you know when new content's coming up. Happy New Year to everyone, and I will see you again on the next episode. Stay safe.